Art is a reflection of self. And when self is so closely enticed with politics and is so intricately connected, that means art is inherently political. And for some films, that message is truer than others. And for the case of James Gray's newest film, Armageddon Time, the self and politics are so closely brought together in his childhood, thus are discussed largely in this film, which means when I'm discussing this film, I am going to be discussing the politics of the storytelling, what it means, what white privilege and institutional racism looks like today and then, and how it reflects how this film is a film about 1980, but also so currently relevant, and what works and doesn't work of that. If you want something provocative, which film is, then watch Armageddon Time. If you want to just shun yourself from the existence, don't watch Armageddon Time and don't watch my review. It's as simple as that. But with that all said, I'm assuming if you're about to start watching my review of Armageddon Time, you're up for all of that. So with that all said, my name is Ben Friedman here from the Beniverse, and welcome to my review of Armageddon Time. All right, now that I got that out of the way, let's discuss James Gray's newest film, Armageddon Time, which is about the kid named Paul Graff, played by Bank Repeta. Paul is a 10-year-old boy who grows up in New York in 1980, right before Ronald Reagan becomes president. This film is about his upbringing in 1980 New York and how that reflects on who he is now and how that reflects on our society as a whole. This is essentially, if I had to describe what this film is about, this is trying to make sense of 2022 by looking back at where we came from, and in this case for James Gray, where he came from in the year 1980 during his upbringing. This film is largely autobiographical in the general sense. This is a film that, like James Gray, he grew up in New York. He had some of these experiences, like going to private school. He lived in this type of house, in this type of economy. His parents were middle class. There was abuse that he experienced from his father. He did have a Jewish grandpa. He did, like, a lot of these ideas that are present within the film are reflective of James Gray's actual upbringing. And this film stars not only Bank Repeta, but also stars performances from Anne Hathaway and Jeremy Strong as his parents in the film, Anthony Hopkins as his grandfather, and Jalen Webb as a black boy named Johnny, who is also good friends with Paul in this film. And let's talk about this film, because this film is supposed to be explaining what 2022 is through the lenses of 1980. It is a reflection of how we got here today. And at the heart of this story, this is supposed to be an anti-nostalgic film. This plays out in all the typical beats of a troubled childhood, a kid who just wants to be an artist and nobody understands him. He has this friend that his family is wary of. And it is supposed to hit on those similar beats of films like Stand By Me or any other just coming of age films. But it's also commenting on something larger. It is no mistake that Paul Graff, his friend in this film, is a young black boy who is disenfranchised, who is made fun of, who is basically struggling so directly due to his race in New York. And it's a film that sees other characters commentate on his blackness. They bully him for it. They're distrusting of him. They do not give him the benefit of the doubt. This is seen as early on at the beginning of the film when the teacher assumes that something Paul did was done by Johnny the black kid in the classroom. He is a bad influence for the class. That's a very central idea of this film. And essentially what James Gray is trying to do in this film is he is wrestling with his upbringing and how much systemic racism played a part of it, and how he reflects and what he has to lose and give and understand about himself to understand that white privilege is true in America. And you see this throughout. Let me just start, before we get a little bit more deep into this film, let me just start with some really strong positives, which are the performances in this film. Acting wise, this film is pretty great. I think everyone gives really good performances. I think Bank Repeta is really a standout as Paul Graff in this film. For such a young actor, I think he brings a dignity and sense to this film and really focuses the story on the friendship between him and the boy Johnny. In doing so, this allows for this film to have an emotional core, especially Paul Graff and his grandfather's story in this film, which is the emotional core of this film. His grandfather is played by Anthony Hopkins. He is a Holocaust survivor, and he's the only one that seems to understand Paul. And they have this beautiful friendship / family connection. And like I said, Hopkins is the only character that understands Paul. And yet he's also the character that's explaining the world to Paul. There's a scene that they have on the bench together. Anthony Hopkins' character and Paul have on the bench together, where they're talking about the fact that Johnny is being treated differently because he's black. And Anthony Hopkins is the one that's basically saying, if you're complicit, you're against him as well. And these are the moments that are really supposed to be the fundamental scenes. Essentially, the film is trying to say that Paul Graff learns his morals from Anthony Hopkins' character. But it also does allow for the fact that Anthony Hopkins' character himself has prejudice and has weight against him. And there is this maybe older conservative nature of him just due to age, that some of the new ideas or practices or integration within the school systems and just overcrowding, how they play into basically Paul Graff not having a great education and struggling within classes because he's not being taken care of, yet while not understanding the politically charged natures of terms like overcrowding, integration into schools, all of that. There's this gap between the two. The two don't exist together in his mind, even though they are existing together in practicality. And that's what this film is trying to do. Who made America the way it is? And without spoiling the film, I can say that there are scenes in this film that directly commentate on the political aspects of 2022 and the Conservative Party of 2022 and the Trumps. There are literally scenes in this movie that directly tie into 2022. And these are the fundamental scenes of this movie. And I will just say right now, Jessica Chastain has a role in this movie. That is not a spoiler because it's been in the trailer. I won't say who she's playing in the film, but there's this scene where she is speaking at a elite elementary school for basically the most privileged of privileged kids in New York. And there's a scene where she is talking about wealth and the ways that we have to obtain wealth and the work that we put in to obtain wealth. It feels very artificial. It feels very fake. And when you understand who this character is, you realize the lies that are being told and how they are disenfranchising basically not only black people, but just the rest of the lower to low class income people in New York. And that's very intentional within this film. This film is very intentional in its storytelling. I think these aspects of the film work to wonders at times. And the issue is also that this film does boil down to struggling to balance the, okay, you're explaining what white privilege looks like. You're explaining what disenfranchised looks like. You're explaining systemic racism as it relates to school boards and on a more broader sense of how it looked like in 1980s. You're explaining the origins of the Republican Party with Reagan. Now you've explained it, and now you're trying to make amends for that in some ways. This is a film that is, I think the term white guilt is a term that I don't want to throw around. I think that is a term that has been largely weaponized by a certain audience to mean something that it doesn't mean. How I am interpreting white guilt, it is someone trying to basically say, but look at me, I am a good person. And I understand my systemic racism roots, and I understand my white privilege. And that's it. But they don't really offer any real solutions. They don't try to engage with it further than that. But all they're really interested in saying is, I understand and I'm not that. And that's the issue, is I think that's ultimately what Armageddon Time boils down to. I know that was a huge ramp to basically get to my biggest issue of the film, is that I think James Gray has the intentions, but yet that message still boils down to him trying to be a good person and explain that he is a good person and he understands what he has done in his life. This is a film that I think is inherently white at times. And that's me as a white person saying that. This film was a film where the characters are white. It's told through a white storytelling lens, which is fine. James Gray is a white storyteller. He has all the right to do that. But the issue is when you're commentating on other people, when you're bringing race into it, it can sometimes get really muddled and it feels like you don't have a handle on the story. That's ultimately where I found the film lacking for me. I thought James Gray lacked that handle on this film. And when he's trying to do so much more, when he's trying to make it a political message and explaining what 2022 is, that's where the film falls apart. There's a scene that is laughably bad near the end of the film where the main character of Paul literally turns his back on somebody, and it's supposed to be him turning his back on what is essentially supposed to be the Republican Party today in 2022. It's so bad because it almost degrades and undermines the idea of what the message was earlier throughout the film, which is understanding that this is something we all have within us. This is something that everyone who is white, everyone who has benefited from systemic racism in any way, that is something that they carry with them. And for him to just do this act, I think it becomes an us versus them type film, which I think is kind of the exact opposite of what this film is trying to be. This film is in large aspects trying to explain white liberalism, and then it kind of goes back to just kind of punching down at conservatives. And again, I'm not above a film doing either of those things. It's just that they so are in juxtaposition with themselves within this film that it didn't work in any particularly meaningful way for me in this film. It feels performative versus authentic. And that's where I struggled with this film. This film is the struggle of performative versus authenticity. So you're left wondering, is this an authentic emotion that the filmmaker is having, or is this a performative motion that the filmmaker is doing, thus saying like, I understand, I am an ally. And that's such a hard thing because that's so personal. When you make a film like that, we are left so in the shade because we don't know what is performative versus authentic. Someone can appear authentic and be doing it completely performative. Someone could also be appearing performative while being authentic. That's what's so hard about this film, where by the end of this film, I felt that it was a performative action from James Gray. I didn't actually feel the authenticity of the story outside of the parts that were very true to him. Like I said, there is a setting of this film, the understanding of what a Jewish middle class, which James Gray lived in New York, the apartment, all of that. It has a feel, the type of humor that the family has, the dynamic that the characters have. That feels authentic. The points where it's trying to be something larger, when it's trying to comment on Paul and Johnny's friendship and ultimately what happens to the character of Johnny, that's where it starts feeling performative. Again, that might not be a fair criticism to laud at this film. Maybe this is a completely authentic and earnest representation that James Gray is trying to do. I myself did not feel that. And I felt that this film was just someone trying to get rid of a dirty conscience that they had, that's something ugly in their past that they didn't want to people judging them for. This film felt like white guilt almost personified. And it's, again, a weird weaponized term to use. And so many of the ideas in this movie are bigger and larger than that. When this film is solely about these two characters having a friendship and Paul experiencing life in 1980s, the film really works. When it's trying to comment on 2022, I think the film fails largely. Thus, Armageddon Time is a film that is a mixed bag for me. Armageddon Time has good ideas, it has bad ideas, it has good intentions at times, and then it has bad execution at other scenes. So thus, Armageddon Time is a movie that I can recommend because it did challenge me. I did think a lot for this film. I did ultimately not enjoy this film, though. Thus, I can give it a 2.5 out of 4 stars solely because I think the performances are so strong in this film. I think it is very provocative. I think this film is very authentic. I think the set design and all of that is just pretty magnificent in this film. But ultimately, I thought the intention that the filmmaker was trying to do didn't fully connect with me. Thus, I'm giving it 2.5 out of 4 stars. I can still suggest you see it. I think there's going to be other people who agree with me. I think there will be other people who disagree with me. And again, this is going to be a film, which I haven't mentioned and I will mention right now. The more you can relate to this story, the more you might enjoy the story. If you have an upbringing similar to this, if you've had past experiences that are more similar to this, you're going to maybe relate to this film. Especially, I think if you're an East Coast, I think this film is so inherently New York that there are going to be other ideas of that film that you relate to, and those really emotional beats might hit more. This film might be affected by your relationship with your grandparents or parents, whether you had an abusive father. All of those things can really shape how you feel this film. This is such a personal work from James Gray that if you connect to that personal, it's going to really work. Thus, that's the struggle of a film. When you make something so personal, it can be so much interpreted through your personality and how you connect and relate to these feelings. And thus, I didn't fully connect to it. And thus, this film struggled for me. Armageddon Time is worth the watch. I'm curious to see the response to it, and I think it's going to be a much more divisive response than the film festivals initially let out. Anyway, thank you for watching my review of Armageddon Time. My name is Ben Friedman here from the Beniverse. Take care. Bye-bye.